Creston Falls announced itself, the way small towns always did, gradually, then all at once. Lena Pruitt had driven 4 hours from Missoula, through country that kept getting quieter, the highway narrowing by degrees, the sky lowering itself onto the mountains like a lid being pressed down on, something that needed containing. She had the heat on and the radio off, and her recorder on the passenger's seat where other people kept coffee, because Lena had learned years ago that the moments worth capturing never waited for you to find the right button. She crested the last ridge at 4:30, and Creston Falls appeared below her, a scatter of rooftops in a valley folded between 2 mountain flanks, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys in pale, vertical lines, the whole picture wrapped in October fog, so dense the tree line blurred into suggestion. It looked like a postcard for a place that didn't want visitors. She pulled over and looked at it for a moment. 7 missing persons, she thought. 3 years, 0 convictions, 0 press. She pulled back onto the road. The town's main street ran 4 blocks and contained everything a person needed to survive, and nothing a person needed to feel comfortable. A diner, a hardware store, a post office that also appeared to sell bait, a bar with a hand-painted sign, and the Alderman Inn, which occupied a converted Victorian at the street's northern end, with the specific dignity of a building that had outlasted everyone who'd ever doubted it. Lena parked in front of it and sat for a moment with the engine idling, doing what she always did when she arrived somewhere new, watching. The street was not empty. There were people on it, a man loading boxes into a truck, 2 women talking outside the hardware store, a teenager on a bicycle moving with the particular aimless purpose of someone with nowhere specific to be. None of them looked at her car. All of them knew it was there. She could feel the awareness moving through the street like a current beneath still water. The consciousness of a place that tracked new arrivals the way a body tracked foreign cells. She turned the engine off and got out. The air hit her immediately, cold and clean in a way Chicago air had forgotten how to be, carrying pine and wood smoke and the distant mineral suggestion of snow that hadn't fallen yet but was making promises. She breathed it in once and felt, absurdly, like she'd been holding her breath for months. The innkeeper was a woman named Patrice, 60, efficient, with eyes that assessed Lena in the time it took to cross the lobby, and arrived at a verdict Lena couldn't read. She had a room ready. Ground floor, end of the hall, window facing the back garden. Patrice did not ask what brought her to Creston Falls. Lena noted that too. She unpacked with the methodical speed of someone who had done it in 100 different rooms. Recorder, laptop, external hard drive. The physical file folder that she still kept because digital files felt too easy to lose and too easy to find by the wrong people. A photograph of her sister's dog that she kept not for sentiment, but because it reminded her what normal looked like when normal started feeling abstract. She called her editor, Doug, while she hung her coat. "I'm in," she said. "Good, what's your read?" "Too early. Town's quiet. Rehearsed kind of quiet." "Meaning?" "Meaning," somebody told them to be. She moved to the window and looked at the back garden, brown grass, a stone wall, a single apple tree with 2 apples left on. "I'll know more in 48 hours. "You've got 2 weeks, Pruitt. Don't spend them being atmospheric." She almost smiled. "I'll file something by Thursday." She ate dinner at the diner alone, a booth by the window, the vinyl cracked along the seat seam, the menu laminated and faded in the way of things that haven't needed updating in years. The food was good. The waitress, a young woman named Bree with a ponytail and an over-practiced smile, was warm in a way that had seams in it. Lena ordered pie she didn't want and asked about the town while Bree refilled her water. "Oh, it's real quiet this time of year," Bree said. "Summer's more lively, hikers and such." "I imagine the wilderness draws people in," Lena said. "The northern ridge especially. Beautiful country." Something moved through Bree's expression. Fast, controlled, gone. "It's pretty," she agreed. "Can I get you anything else?" Lena said no. She watched Bree carry the question back behind the counter and set it down somewhere out of reach. The older man at the counter, flannel shirt, coffee cup, The posture of someone who had occupied that stool for decades had gone very still during the exchange. Lena looked at him once casually. He looked back. Then he put $2 under his cup and left without finishing his coffee. She ate her pie slowly. It was apple. It was excellent. She logged the interaction on her recorder in a murmur quiet enough that only she could hear it, then tucked the device in her jacket pocket and walked back to the inn through air that had dropped another 5 degrees since she arrived. Patrice was behind the desk when she came in, working on something in a ledger with a pen. She looked up and said goodnight and looked back down. Warm, calibrated, friendly in a way that had a door in it, and the door was closed. Lena said goodnight and went to her room. She sat at the small desk and opened her laptop and began building the organizational framework she always built. A map of what she knew, what she suspected, what she needed, and what she was willing to be wrong about. The 7 files, the 7 names, the 7 last known locations, all within 3 miles of the northern ridge, all within the past 3 years, all connected by the single strand of geography and the second strand of the Mercer name appearing somewhere in each trail before it went cold. She worked until 10. Then she closed the laptop and brushed her teeth and turned off the light. She was almost asleep when she heard it. The soft, specific sound of something sliding under her door. She was on her feet before she was fully awake. Years of working in places that didn't want journalists had calibrated her nervous system for exactly this frequency of wrong. She crossed the room and picked up the folded piece of paper from the floor, unfolded it, read it in the pale stripe of light coming under the curtain from the parking lot outside. Stop asking about the forest. I'm not the danger here. No signature. The handwriting was precise, controlled. The kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who measured everything before committing to it. She stood in the dark room with the note in her hand and her heart running fast and quiet in her chest. And she did something she would later have difficulty explaining to herself. She believed it. Chapter 2, The Man in the Dark. The power went out at 9 o'clock the following evening. Without ceremony or warning, the lights simply stopped, and the world became its own darker version of itself. Lena was in the lobby, standing at the small desk along the wall, where guests apparently paid for things before the era of card machines, trying to get a cell signal strong enough to send her initial observations to Doug when the darkness arrived. The emergency light above the front door kicked on after a moment. Amber, dim, the kind of light that revealed rather than illuminated, that showed you shapes and made you supply the details yourself. Patrice appeared from the back with a flashlight and the resigned competence of someone whose relationship with the power grid had always been complicated. Happens this time of year, she said, to no one in particular. The wind takes a line down somewhere and the whole valley goes with it. Could be an hour, could be morning. Lena had just decided to go back to her room and work by the light of her laptop screen when the front door opened. He did not make an entrance. He simply arrived, the way weather arrived, as a shift in the room's atmosphere before you could identify the cause. A tall man in a dark coat, unhurried, moving through the amber light, with the particular certainty of someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged somewhere. He was younger than she'd expected. Somewhere in his 30s, she catalogued automatically, with dark hair and the kind of face that had been made by a combination of good structure and difficult experience, neither soft nor harsh, both. Patrice looked up and said his name like it was a complete sentence. Mr. Mercer, so this was him. Lena had prepared for Zane Mercer the way she prepared for all subjects. Through research, through the careful construction of expectation. County records. The land deeds that placed his family in this valley for 4 generations. The single photograph she'd found online, taken at a local fundraiser 6 years ago, grainy and peripheral. A man at the edge of a group who looked like he'd agreed to be in the photograph as a favor to someone he liked. She had built a version of him in her mind from the shape of his absence in the public record. A man who controlled information the way other men controlled money. deliberately and with full understanding of its value. She had not prepared for the amber light to catch his eyes and hold there a half-second too long. He spoke to Patrice briefly. Something about a generator part he'd had delivered. Something about whether she'd called the line company. His voice was low and unhurried, and he had the kind of diction that suggested he said exactly what he meant and edited before speaking rather than during. Patrice was clearly comfortable with him, in the way that people were comfortable with fixtures, things that had always been there and were therefore trustworthy. Then he looked at Lena. She had been cataloging him with the practiced invisibility of a journalist who had learned to observe without being observed. She had apparently not been invisible. "Mrs. Pruitt," he said. Not a question. She kept her expression professionally neutral. "You have me at a disadvantage. Creston Falls is a small town." "Small towns talk," she said. "I'm counting on it." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not quite amusement. Something more restrained and more interesting than either. "Is that what you're finding?" "I'm finding that small towns also know how to say a great deal without saying anything at all." She held his gaze. "It's a skill. It's a survival mechanism," he said. The correction was gentle. Something in it was not. She filed that away. She filed the way he'd looked at her when he said it. Not like a man assessing a threat, but like a man identifying something he hadn't seen coming and was still deciding how to feel about that. She filed the fact that he did not ask her what she was doing in Creston Falls, which meant he already knew, which meant he had known before he walked in here, which meant this was not the casual encounter it had appeared to be. "I'd like to request an interview," she said, formally. "Through your office if you prefer." "I don't have an office," he said. "I have a lodge." "Then through your lodge." The almost smile again. It was beginning to frustrate her in a specific way she declined to examine. "My assistant will be in touch," he said. He looked at her for one more moment, one beat longer than the conversation required. And then he was moving toward the door, and then he was gone, and the lobby felt measurably different after him, in the way a room felt different after a fire was put out. Lena stood in the amber emergency light and became aware, with clinical detachment, that her pulse was misbehaving. She went to her room. She read over her notes. She reviewed the 7 files again and fell asleep with her laptop open. At midnight, something woke her, a sound she couldn't name, small and deliberate. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quality of the silence. Then she got up and found the note on the floor. She had read it the night before. She read it again now, in the glow of her phone screen, standing in the room that Zane Mercer's assistant had not yet contacted her from. "Stop asking about the forest. I'm not the danger here." She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the note and thought about the amber light and the way it had caught in his eyes. She thought about the phrasing. Not "there is no danger," but "I'm not the danger." A precise man making a precise distinction. She thought about believing someone you had no rational reason to believe. She thought about the fact that she already did. She put the note in her file folder, next to the 7 faces she'd come here for, and lay back down and stared at the ceiling until her pulse settled into something she could work with. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees. Somewhere distant, not quite far enough, something that was not the wind moved with it. Chapter 3. Everything he won't say. The fog was so thick on Wednesday morning that the lodge appeared out of it like a thought becoming solid. First the shape, then the detail, then the reality of the thing all at once. Lena parked and sat for a moment, looking at it through the windshield. It was large without being ostentatious. 3 stories of dark timber and stone, the kind of architecture that had grown from its landscape rather than been imposed on it. Smoke from 2 chimneys, warm light in the ground floor windows, despite the hour. The forest pressed close on 3 sides, the trees enormous and old, the kind of trees that had been standing long enough to have opinions. She gathered her recorder and her notebook and got out. He met her at the door himself. This was the first of several things that did not fit the profile she'd constructed. No assistant, no lawyer, No performance of the powerful man in his domain. Just Zane Mercer, in a dark sweater and boots, opening his own door, stepping back to let her in without ceremony or announcement. The interior hit her like an argument she wasn't prepared for. It was warm. Not the curated warmth of a showroom, but the accumulated warmth of a place that was genuinely lived in. Books on surfaces that weren't bookshelves. A coat thrown over a chair that was also holding a pair of gloves. A kitchen visible through an archway where something had recently been cooked, and the evidence was still on the counter. The kind of home that trusted itself. She catalogued it all and said nothing. He made coffee. She did not offer to help, because she wanted to watch him move through the space. And watching him move through the space told her things. The casual ownership of it. The way he knew where everything was without looking. The way the room arranged itself around him, rather than the other way. He set a mug in front of her at the kitchen table and sat across from it and looked at her with the focused attention of someone who had learned patience the hard way. "You said you'd answer questions," she said. "I said I'd meet with you," he corrected, mildly. "Questions are a reasonable inference." She set her recorder on the table between them. He looked at it without expression. She took that as consent and pressed record. She asked the questions she'd prepared. About the land, the family history, the relationship with local government, the missing persons cases, the county reports. He answered all of them, technically, completely, with the precision of a man who understood exactly where the line between truth and disclosure ran and had no intention of crossing it. It was impressive. It was also infuriating in a way she had to keep off her face. He told her the county handled the missing persons cases. She told him the reports had gaps. He agreed that county resources were limited. She told him 4 of the 7 last known locations fell within a quarter-mile of his property boundary. He told her that the northern ridge was public land and people were free to access it. She told him that was not what she asked. He picked up his coffee. She watched him. He watched her back. The fog pressed against every window in the kitchen and made the room feel like the only place in the world. "You're better at this than they told me," he said. "Who told you?" He refilled her coffee instead of answering. She let the deflection sit between them without filling it. Silence was a tool. Most people couldn't tolerate it. Zane Mercer sat inside it like he'd furnished the place. After a moment, she tried a different angle. "The people in this valley trust you," she said, not an accusation. An observation offered neutrally. Something shifted in his expression. "Barely. I hope so," he said. "That's not the same as saying you've earned it." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her directly. "But I have." She believed that too. She was developing a pattern she didn't love. She asked 2 more questions she already knew the answers to give herself time to study him without appearing to. And then she closed her notebook and picked up her recorder and stood. He walked her to the door without hurrying, which meant he was in no rush to have her leave, which was more information than anything he'd said in the last hour. Near the door, she stopped. On the wall, slightly to the left of a coat rack, hung at the particular casualness of something that had been there long enough to stop being noticed, was a photograph in a plain, dark frame. 7 people standing at what was unmistakably the northern ridge. The tree line behind them, the light, the specific gold of a late summer afternoon. She knew the ridge from the map she had memorized in Missoula. She knew 2 of the faces from the missing persons files. She reached for her phone. He stepped beside her, not in front of her, not blocking. Beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth from him against her arm. And he let her look. And she realized, with a lurch of something she couldn't name, that the people in the photograph were not missing. They were standing in the hallway behind her. She saw them in the glass reflection of the frame. 4 people in the corridor, watching, quiet, present, very much alive. She lowered her phone. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the glass. She looked at Zane Mercer's profile, 6 inches from hers, patient as the forest outside. "I see," she said carefully. "I know," he said. She left without asking the question that had just rewritten itself entirely in her mind. She drove back through the fog with her hands careful on the wheel and her thoughts moving fast and in new directions, and she sat in the Alderman Inn parking lot for a full 5 minutes before she trusted herself to go inside and look like someone who had a handle on what was happening. She did not have a handle on what was happening. She was beginning to think that might be the point. Chapter 4. The Ridge. He called her Thursday morning before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. His voice on the phone was the same as in person, unhurried, precise, the kind of voice that didn't perform itself. "The Ridge," he said, "this morning. I'll walk it with you." She should have asked why. She said she'd be ready in an hour. They met at the northern trailhead, where a dirt road ended in a gate with a private property sign that Zane's unlocked with a key from his coat pocket and held open for her without comment. The trail beyond it was wide enough for two, but they walked with 6 inches between them, the forest closing over the path within the first 100 yards, until the gate and the road disappeared and there was only the pine and the cold air and the sound of their footsteps on the fallen needles. He walked slightly ahead of her, she noticed. She noticed also that he positioned himself consistently between her and the tree line to the east, which was subtle enough to be deniable and deliberate enough to be unmistakable once she'd seen it. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" She gestured toward the tree line. He looked at her steadily. "I know," he said, and kept doing it. She let it go. She focused on the ridge, on the geography, on the places she'd mapped against the last known locations in the files. Here, approximately, was where the second case's trail had gone cold. There, 50 yards ahead, was the approximate location of the fourth. She walked the distances in her mind and looked at the forest with professional eyes and tried to build a picture of what had happened here, and found, with increasing frustration, that the picture kept refusing to resolve into anything she recognized, because nothing here felt like crime. The forest felt like forest, managed, old, deeply alive, the kind of wilderness that had been respected long enough to trust the people moving through it. She'd been in places where things had gone badly wrong, and they had a feeling, a specific absence of ease, a way the light fell that seemed to apologize. This place had none of that. Halfway along the ridge, Zane stopped walking. She stopped 2 steps later and turned to look at him. He was utterly still. Not the stillness of listening, the stillness of something that has finished listening and arrived at a conclusion. His eyes were on the tree line to the east, the eastern edge of the forest, the darkest section of it where the old growth was thickest and the light gave up. The air changed. She didn't hear anything. She didn't see anything, but something in the complex animal layer of her nervous system that she spent most of her life ignoring in favor of reason fired a single clear note of wrong, and she felt it from her sternum to her feet. His hand found her shoulder, not gripping, just present. He turned her gently toward the trail back. "We're heading back," he said. Not a suggestion, not a question. The tone of someone who had made a decision and was informing her of it as a courtesy. She went, not because he told her to. She was careful about that distinction, holding it like a small flag, but because her own body had already started moving before he touched her, and she was interested, enough in the relationship between her instincts and his, to see where it led. They walked back faster than they'd come. He stayed close. She didn't protest. At the lodge, the adrenaline still humming faintly in her hands, she turned to him on the porch and asked what was out there. "Wildlife," he said. "That was not wildlife body language," she said. "Yours or mine." He looked at her. In the flat gray light of the overcast morning, his eyes were darker than they'd been inside, some quality of the outdoor light, revealing a depth in them she hadn't clocked before. "Wildlife in this forest can be unpredictable," he said. "I'd rather not take chances with someone I'm responsible for. I didn't agree to be your responsibility." "No," he said, "but here we are." She stared at him. He looked back with the infuriating serenity of someone who had already won an argument she hadn't started yet. "I'll come back to the ridge alone," she said. If you won't tell me what's out there, I know you will. Something crossed his face, not quite concern. Something older and more complicated than concern. That's what worries me. She went inside. He made lunch without asking if she wanted any, and she ate it without asking why he'd made it. And they sat across the kitchen table again, with the fog and the forest outside, and something between them that had shifted on the ridge and not shifted back. She left at 3. The light was already failing. She was halfway down the access road when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words, "Don't go back alone." She stopped the car. She looked at the message. She pulled up Zane's contact and compared the number. They didn't match. She looked at the forest on either side of the road. The trees were still and enormous and dark. The fog had come down again, filling the gaps between them, with something that was not quite light and not quite darkness. Someone else was watching the ridge. Someone who knew she'd been on it today. Someone who was not Zane Mercer. She drove back to the inn with her recorder running on the passenger seat, narrating what she'd seen and what she'd felt and what she couldn't yet explain. And she did not mention, even to herself, the specific quality of his hand on her shoulder, and the fact that it was the most safe she'd felt since she arrived in Creston Falls. Chapter 5. What Marcus Broke. Marcus Webb arrived on a Thursday with a rental car, a carry-on bag, and a smile that Lena recognized the way you recognized a song that used to mean something, immediately, involuntarily, with a faint accompanying sensation of loss. They had worked together for 3 years at the Tribune. They had been something more than colleagues, and less than everything else for about 8 months of that. The kind of relationship that exists in the space between what 2 people want and what they're willing to say out loud. It had ended without drama, which somehow made it harder to put down than the relationships that ended loudly. "Pruitt," he said when he found her at the diner. His smile was genuine and strategic simultaneously, which was a skill she'd always grudgingly admired. "Marcus." She folded her hands around her coffee cup. "Who sent you?" "The Chronicle." He sat across from her without being invited, which had always been a Marcus trait. The comfortable assumption of welcome. "Mercer's been on their radar for months. Different angle than yours. I heard you were here." "Heard from who?" "You know how it goes." She did. The journalism world was small and had excellent hearing. "What's your angle?" he told her. It was the angle she'd feared, the one that framed Zane as a powerful reclusive figure with something to hide, that used the missing persons cases as implication without evidence, that traded in suggestion because suggestion was legally defensible. It was the kind of story that damaged without proving. She had written that kind of story exactly once, early in her career, and the memory of it lived in the same room as the worst decisions she'd ever made. She told Marcus she wasn't sharing her research. He told her they could help each other. She told him she'd think about it. She spent the rest of the day thinking about how to make sure he didn't get within 10 feet of her files. The meeting at the lodge that evening had not been her idea. Marcus had called Zane's assistant directly, efficiently, without scruple, and arranged it before she knew it was happening. She arrived to find both men in the main room, standing on opposite sides of it with the specific energy of 2 animals who have identified each other as a different kind of problem. Zane shook Marcus's hand. She watched the interaction the way she watched everything, for the gap between the surface and what was underneath it. Zane's grip was brief, and his expression was professionally pleasant, and his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, moved her face before moving back to Marcus, and what moved through them in that fraction of a second was something she felt in her chest before she could name it. Marcus, to his credit and her slight alarm, felt it too. She watched him register it and recalibrate. He was smart. That was always the problem with Marcus. The evening progressed with careful surface civility, and beneath it, like the thing in the tree line, like the current under the still water of Creston Falls, something moved. Zane, without performing it, without making it visible enough to be called out, managed to be near her consistently. a shoulder in her proximity when they stood at the window, his voice dropping slightly when he spoke to her, not to Marcus. A hand that brushed the back of her chair and lingered for one breath longer than furniture required. She told herself it was territorial pack behavior. She had done enough background research into pack dynamics to give it a name. Naming it helped approximately nothing. Marcus had accessed her cloud files. She found out when he mentioned a specific detail from her notes that she had not shared verbally. A detail she had recorded and typed up and synced to the drive she should have locked before he arrived and hadn't, because she'd been thinking about ridge trails and amber eyes and notes slipped under doors. The confrontation that followed was brief and unpleasant. Marcus was unapologetic, with the particular confidence of someone who believed the ends justified most means. She was furious with the specific controlled fury of someone who had been burned by this exact mechanism before, and had sworn it wouldn't happen again. Zane across the room went very still. Marcus pushed further. He wanted a sit-down. He wanted Zane on record. He wanted Lena's cooperation framed as professional inevitability. He was compelling, the way bad ideas were always compelling, fluently, with apparent reasonableness, right up until the moment he said something that crossed a line Lena couldn't see until it was behind him. She didn't see exactly what happened next. She saw the before and the after. In the before, Zane was standing still across the room, controlled, watching. In the after, he was 3 feet from Marcus, and the temperature of the room had changed, and Marcus had stopped talking. And Zane's eyes between the before and the after had changed color. Not subtly, not metaphorically. The dark irises had gone gold, lit from somewhere behind them, ancient and enormous and entirely real for the span of a breath. One breath, then dark again. She was 3 feet away. She saw it with complete clarity. She stood very still and did not make a sound. Marcus left that night. He said goodbye to her in the parking lot and told her she was compromised, and she told him she was working, and he looked at her with something that might have been genuine worry under the professional frustration and said, "Be careful, Lena." Then he got in his rental car, and the taillights disappeared into the fog. She stood in the cold parking lot and turned what she'd seen over in her mind, methodically, honestly, without the comfortable refuge of disbelief. She was a person who dealt in facts. The fact was, she had seen his eyes change. The fact was, she was not afraid. The fact that she was not afraid was the most frightening thing about it. She went back inside. The lodge hallway was empty, lit by a single sconce at the far end, long and quiet and smelling of wood smoke. She stood in it, and her heart moved fast, and she breathed through it, and she was still standing there, not quite ready to move when she heard his footsteps. He came around the corner from the main room and stopped when he saw her. The hallway held them both. "You should be afraid of me," he said. Quiet, direct, costing him something. She looked at him. At the face she had been cataloging for days, without admitting she was memorizing it. At the man who had walked between her and the tree line, who had made her lunch without asking, whose employees moved around him like planets around something with gravity. At the eyes that were dark now and human now, and looking at her with something so unguarded, she felt almost that she should look away out of courtesy. "I know," she said. Neither of them moved. The hallway was very quiet. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, small and tentative, barely a whisper against the windows, and neither of them noticed because they were too busy standing very still in the same space and breathing the same air and not moving. Chapter 6. I know. She wasn't sure who moved first. She thought later that neither of them did, that it was the hallway itself that contracted, that the space between them shrank by some physics that had nothing to do with either of their decisions. One moment 6 feet, then 3, then a distance that had no name beyond close, not touching, but close. "What did you see?" he asked. "You know what I saw. I want to hear you say it." She met his eyes. Your eyes changed. The irises went gold. Something enormous looked out through them for about a second. She kept her voice even, clinical, the voice she used when she was most unsettled. and needed to hear herself sound otherwise. I've read enough to have context for what that means. And I'm standing here, she said, instead of in my car. He looked at her for a long time. Something in him was deciding something. She could feel the weight of it. Then he stepped back, fractionally, giving her air, and tilted his head toward the main room. Come in, he said. I'll make tea, and I'll answer questions. Actually answer them? Actually answer them. The main room was firelit and quiet, and the snow was falling in whispers past the windows. He made tea with the focus of someone who understood that making tea was not about tea. She sat on the couch and watched him and said nothing, and the saying nothing felt, for the first time in days, like a choice rather than a strategy. He told her what he was, simply, without performance or apology. The way you told someone something that was simply true. The way you'd tell them the name of a mountain or the depth of a river, as though the information had always existed and you were only now finding the occasion to share it. She asked questions. He answered them. An hour passed. The fire moved through its own slow drama. The tea went from hot to warm, and she didn't drink enough of it. She asked about the pack, about the people in the photograph, about the missing persons who were not missing. He explained the system quietly. The people who came to Creston Falls, broken or hunted, or simply unable to exist in the world they'd been assigned. The pack's practice of offering a different kind of world. The careful erasure of trails that might bring the wrong attention. He explained it without asking for her approval and without bracing for her judgment. And she found that the explanation fit the evidence she'd been accumulating in a way that her original theory never quite had. She had been looking for crime. She had found community. Then she told him about Sadie. She hadn't planned to. It came out the way things came out when you'd been holding them in the wrong position for too long, and something finally shifted. A source she'd protected for 18 months. A story she'd published because it was true, and because the truth felt like justification. The consequences she hadn't let herself fully calculate until Sadie called her from a number she didn't recognize from a city she refused to name and said simply, I had to disappear. The particular quality of the silence on Zina's end of that call. The way she'd put the phone down and sat with what she'd done. I've been chasing the story that balances the scale ever since, she said. The one where what I expose protects people instead of costing them. The fire moved. He said nothing for a moment. She appreciated the nothing. The genuine receiving of what she'd said, rather than the rush to fill the space it made. You thought that story was mine, he said finally. I thought it might be. And now? She looked at the fire. Now I think I had the geography right and the content entirely wrong. He told her about the rival faction then, the other pack, older, colder, operating with the specific ruthlessness of people who believed that power required the elimination of anything that complicated it. They had been moving through the Northern Territory for 6 months, eliminating witnesses, buying land through a shell company. They had known about Lena before she arrived. The note under her door, I'm not the danger here, had been written by his pack's elder, Maris, who had wanted to scare her into leaving. Why didn't you want me scared into leaving? She asked. He looked at her across the firelit space. There were 3 feet between them, and the 3 feet felt different than they had in the hallway. Less like distance, and more like measurement. Because you wouldn't have gone, he said. You don't scare the way they expected. A pause. Something moved through his expression, careful and deliberate, like a door being opened slowly. And because I didn't want you to. The honesty of it arrived like a change in pressure. She felt it in her ears, in her chest, in the specific place behind her ribs, where she kept the things she didn't let herself want too openly. She reached across the 3 feet and put her hand over his where it rested on the cushion between them. His hand turned slowly beneath hers. Not grasping, just receiving, his thumb against her knuckles, barely moving. Neither of them breathed for a moment. Outside, the snow had gotten serious. It fell past the windows in steady curtains, the whole world beyond the glass becoming simpler, wider, quieter. Inside, the fire kept its counsel, and the room held them the way rooms hold things they recognize as important. She thought about leaving. She thought about her editor and her files, and the story that had become a different story. She thought about what it meant to be a person who ran toward complicated things, and then seemed genuinely surprised when the complicated things had weight. She thought about his voice last night when he said, "I didn't want you to." She didn't leave. Chapter 7. Inside the World. She met Cord on a Saturday morning. He was leaning against the lodge's kitchen counter when she came in from the porch, drinking coffee and occupying the room the way large, quiet men occupied rooms, thoroughly, without apparent effort. He was mid-40s, with the build of someone who had done physical work his entire life, and the face of someone who had thought hard about most of it. He looked at her without warmth or hostility, which she had learned by now was the specific register of someone reserving judgment rather than withholding it. "Cord," Zane said from the stove. "This is Lena, not the journalist, not our guest, just her name, offered with the particular simplicity of an introduction that assumed its own significance." Cord looked at her for one more beat. Then he nodded once and said, "Coffee's good this morning," and turned back to the window. She understood somehow that this was welcome. The others came into focus over the course of that day, gradually, naturally, the way things revealed themselves in Creston Falls. Not all at once, but in increments, each one requiring her to adjust her picture slightly before the next one arrived. Maris, the pack elder, was 70 or thereabouts, with silver hair cut short and eyes the particular sharp gray of winter sky, and a way of looking at Lena that felt less like assessment and more like recognition. She shook Lena's hand and held it a moment longer than necessary and said, "You're more sensible than I expected." Coming from Maris, Lena gathered, this was not faint praise. The younger members of the pack moved through the lodge with a domestic ease that she found quietly disarming. The world she'd been prepared for, the mythology of it, the cinematic version, was nothing like this. It was ordinary in the ways that mattered. People who made meals and argued about the firewood supply and teased each other across the kitchen table and deferred to Zane, not with fear, but with the kind of trust that was earned incrementally, the kind you could feel the specific weight of. She watched him move through it all and filed things away and stopped pretending that what she was filing was professional research. He moved through his world the way he moved through everything, with a quality of presence that was neither performance nor accident, the kind of gravity that didn't demand attention, but inevitably received it. She watched Cord bring him something that required a decision, and watched him make the decision quickly and clearly, and watched Cord nod and go. She watched Maris stop beside him and say something low that made him listen with his whole body. She watched him with the youngest member of the pack, barely 20, still wearing the slightly unmoored look of someone who hadn't yet found their footing in the world he'd been welcomed into. And the patience he offered was so uncalculated, she had to look away from it. She stayed for dinner without being asked and left briefly after to get her laptop and her overnight bag, because Zane had not suggested she stay, and she hadn't asked permission, and neither of them mentioned the decision out loud, which felt like its own kind of language. That evening, the whole pack settled into the main room the way a family settled, not tidily, not symmetrically, but with the organic arrangement of people who trusted their shared space. The fire had been going since afternoon. The snow outside had slowed to occasional murmuring. Someone had put music on low somewhere, not quite audible, just present. She fell asleep on the couch without intending to. She was aware of it happening and unable to prevent it, and not, she discovered, particularly motivated to try. The fire, the warmth, the weight of the week, the specific quality of safety that the lodge had built around her, one careful increment at a time. It had made her body decide, without consulting her, that this was a place where sleep was possible. She registered dimly the shift of the cushion beside her, the settling of something warm and substantial against the couch's back, the sound of the fire doing its quiet work. Then she was fully asleep. She surfaced once, briefly, barely, a thin layer of consciousness floating up through the dark, at the weight of a blanket settling over her, at the warmth that was still there, close, at his voice, very low, careful, speaking to what it believed was silence. I would burn the whole forest down before I let them touch you. She lay still. Her eyes did not open. Her breathing did not change. She held the words in her chest, the way you held something you were afraid to put down. Then the conscious layer sank again, and she slept, and the fire kept burning, and outside in the dark tree line, something moved with a purpose that was not peaceful and was not small. She would find out about that in the morning. Chapter 8. The Fire and After. Cord's briefing was delivered in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, with the specific tonelessness of someone who had learned to report bad news without the performance of it. The rival pack, what remained of the faction Zane had called the Varen, had moved through the eastern boundary overnight. Not an attack, a message, territorial marking in the old way. The way that meant we are here and we are not leaving and we want you to know we are not afraid of you. 2 of Zane's pack had been on perimeter watch. They were unharmed, but the encounter had been close. Cord laid it out in sentences that were the minimum required to convey the maximum information, and Zane listened at the kitchen counter with his coffee going cold in his hand and his expression doing the thing it did when he was processing something serious. Very still, very inward, the stillness of a depth rather than a surface. Lena stood in the kitchen doorway. She did not pretend she wasn't listening. When Cord finished, Zane looked up. He found her in the doorway immediately, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through spaces, always aware of where she was. Not obsessively, not performatively, but with the quiet precision of a compass finding north. You should go back to Chicago, he said. Your editor is calling. Marcus's story ran yesterday. It takes some of the pressure off. You have what you came for. She looked at him. Do I? Lena? Don't, she said, quietly, without heat. The word that meant don't ask me to be less than I actually am in this moment. Cord, with the discretion of a man who had spent years reading rooms, found a reason to be somewhere else. Doug called at 9. She took the call on the porch, with the mountain enormous behind the tree line, and the morning air cold enough to make her breath visible. Each exhale a brief small ghost that dispersed immediately into the larger cold. Doug wanted to know if she had a story. She told him she had something better than a story. She had a story worth telling correctly, which was different, and she needed 2 more weeks to tell it that way. He asked what had changed her timeline. She said the situation was more complex than the original brief. He said that was either a journalist answer or a personal one. She didn't confirm which. She came back inside. Zane was standing in the kitchen doorway now. The same doorway she'd occupied 20 minutes ago. Their positions exchanged, the symmetry of it saying something she couldn't quite translate. He had been watching the porch. He did not pretend otherwise. She crossed the kitchen. She stopped in front of him. Close, the kind of close that was no longer deniable as accidental. She looked up. He looked down. The space between them had the quality of something that had been getting smaller for days and had finally arrived at its smallest possible version. I heard you, she said, last night. What you said. His entire body went very still, a different kind of still than his professional stillness, not controlled, not managed, the stillness of something that has run out of places to hide. I'm not leaving, she said. That's my answer. She watched something move through his face, relief and recognition, and something older and simpler than either, something that had no words she knew in any language she'd been taught. His hand came up slowly, the way you moved towards something you were afraid of disturbing, and touched her jaw, his thumb at the edge of her cheekbone, his palm against her face with a warmth that made her realize how long she had been cold. She moved into it, into him. The last half-inch closing like a door settling into its frame. Inevitable final right. The kiss was slow, there was no other word for it. Slow and deliberate, and full of the specific weight of everything that had been said and not said in every room they'd shared. His mouth was warm and certain, and unhurried in the way he was unhurried in everything that mattered. Her hands found the fabric of his sweater and held. His hand stayed at her jaw, the thumb moving once, slowly, carefully, across her cheekbone. When they separated, the air between them felt different, used, changed. He pressed his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel his breath against her face, slightly unsteady, the first unsteady thing she had ever detected in him. "You are the most inconvenient thing," he said, very quietly, "that has ever happened to me." She almost laughed. She felt the shape of it in her chest, the genuine, helpless warmth of it. Then Cord's voice cut through the lodge from the front, sharp, urgent. The voice he used when professional had become emergency. "Zane." They separated. His eyes opened. Whatever had been there, soft, undone, human, closed back into the controlled focus she knew. "Stay inside," he said. Not a request. "Zane, please." The word landed differently than she expected. Not commanding, not even asking. The sound of a man who had very little experience of please and meant every syllable of it. She stayed inside for 4 minutes. Then she heard something at the back of the lodge that was not the wind. Chapter 9. The storm breaks. She had covered conflict. She knew the specific quality of silence that preceded violence. The way it thickened. The way the air became too careful. The way her own body had learned to read it before her mind caught up. The silence at the lodge's back corridor had that quality. She moved through it with the recorder in her pocket and her phone in her hand, and the particular sharp clarity that fear produced when it was working correctly. Not paralysis, not panic, but the heightened processing of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds mattered. The man who came through the back entrance was not large. That was the first thing she noted. Not large, not loud, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had done this before and didn't need to announce themselves to feel effective. He had found the back door before she heard him coming, which meant he'd been watching the lodge long enough to know its layout. She recognized him as Varen before he said anything. The way he moved, the quality of his attention, the same ancient, enormous thing she'd seen in Zane's eyes that night in the hallway, but colder here, flatter, like the same fire burning in a room with no oxygen. His name, she would learn later, was Garrett. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her recorder and her phone. He looked at her face. He smiled the kind of smile that meant he wasn't worried about her doing anything useful with either. "You're the journalist," he said. "I am," she said. She pressed record without looking at the device. "And you're trespassing. I'm retrieving something that belongs to my people. There's nothing of yours in this building. Not a thing." His eyes moved over her with the specific consideration of someone calculating leverage. "The alpha's attached to you, fast. That's interesting. That's actually very interesting. I'd focus less on what's interesting and more on the sound of 4 people who are about to come through the front of this building," she said. He looked toward the front. A fraction of a second barely. She used it. She was not a fighter. She was a journalist who had been in enough dangerous rooms to know that the point was never to win. The point was to buy time. She put the doorframe between herself and him, and she screamed, not in fear, in function, loud and directional, the way Maris had told her to if anything happened inside the lodge. Garrett was fast. He covered the distance in a second she didn't have. Zane covered it in half of one. She felt the displacement of air before she processed the movement. One moment Garrett was 2 feet from her, then Zane was between them, and Garrett was at the far wall, and the corridor had become something she couldn't fully translate with ordinary vocabulary. She pressed herself against the doorframe and watched. What Zane did was not violence for spectacle. It was efficient and complete, and carried the specific quality of someone protecting something irreplaceable. It lasted seconds. When it was over, Garrett was gone, through the back entrance, into the night, and Zane was standing in the corridor, breathing harder than she had ever seen him breathe. He turned to her. His eyes went to her face first, her hands, her throat, checking, not for damage, for her, the way you checked for someone who mattered. The gold was present in his irises still, fading back toward dark as she watched, the ancient enormous thing retreating as the human thing came back. Before she could speak, the blizzard arrived. It arrived the way the best and worst things arrived, without announcement, without transition, fully itself, all at once. The world outside the windows went white. The wind hit the lodge like a decision. Within 10 minutes, visibility was gone. Within 30, the northern ridge was impassable under 2 feet of rapidly accumulating snow. The Varen did not return that night. The lodge filled with the quiet aftermath of something enormous. Maris moved through the space with the calm precision of a woman who had survived enough to know that surviving required forward motion. 2 of Zane's pack had minor injuries from the perimeter breach. She addressed them with efficiency, and something underneath the efficiency, that was the specific tenderness of someone who was not going to let anyone see how frightened she'd been. Lena moved through the space and did what she knew how to do, making tea, staying present, holding the edges of things steady without being asked. Cord watched her from across the kitchen for a long moment, and then said nothing, which from Cord she had learned to read as significant. The blizzard raged. She sat in the study later, when the main room had quieted, standing at the window, watching the white world outside, holding a mug she'd stopped drinking from, turning Garrett's words over in her mind. He'll leave you. 3 words delivered in the specific register of someone who believed they were offering information rather than manipulation. She turned them over with the care she gave to everything she wasn't certain of, testing their weight, checking them against what she'd learned. They didn't hold. She was still at the window when she heard Zane come in. He stopped behind her, not touching, present. The particular presence she had learned to feel before she heard it. What did he say to you? His voice was quiet, even, costing him the effort of the evenness, she told him. She said the 3 words plainly, without drama, the way she said things she was not afraid of. His jaw tightened. She saw it reflected in the window glass. He came around to stand beside her, facing the window, the blizzard white and enormous outside, the study warm behind them. He looked at the snow for a moment, then he turned and looked at her. Do you believe that? The question was quiet, bare. She understood what it cost him. This man who moved through his world with complete internal authority, asking her, sincerely, whether she trusted him, leaving himself open in a way that had no defense. She turned to face him fully, and she answered. Chapter 10, Morning Clean and White. No, she said, I don't believe that. He waited. He always waited. One of the things she had cataloged about him early, and continued to find disarming, the quality of his attention. He didn't reach for the rest of what she was saying. He let it come. You are a man, she said, who has made himself an island, and I understand why. Because islands are defensible. Because when you carry what you carry and protect what you protect, the math of exposure doesn't favor letting people close. She looked at him, steadily. But you let me close, not strategically, not because it served some other purpose. You let me close because something in you decided to. And I watched you decide it every time. 100 small decisions. The coffee, and the ridge, and the hallway, and the forehead against mine, and that is not the behavior of a man who is planning to leave. The study was very quiet. The blizzard had softened overnight to something gentler, occasional, decorative, a world trying on white. He said it because it was the most destabilizing thing he could think of, she continued. Which means you leaving is the thing he's most afraid of. Because if you stay and I stay, there's someone on the outside of the story now. Someone who knows it and won't weaponize it. She tilted her head slightly. He was right to be worried about that. Zane looked at her for a long time. The gold was gone from his eyes, just dark and human and completely open, in a way she was learning was rare. The specific rarity of something offered, without guarantee of safe receipt. Then he told her. Not with the controlled precision she'd come to expect, with something that was underneath the precision, older, quieter, the voice of a person rather than an alpha. He told her what she was to him in the vocabulary of his world, the word his kind used for the person who arrived and changed the architecture of everything, who made the island want to be a continent. He said it simply. He did not apologize for the size of it. He did not look away. She held it. She was a woman who dealt in language, who understood the weight of words and the specific gravity of the ones that could not be taken back. She felt this one land with the completeness of something irrevocable and found that the irrevocability did not frighten her. "I'm not going back to Chicago," she said. "Not yet." She paused. "Maybe not ever. I have a story to write. Not the one you came for. No, a different one." She let herself almost smile. About a town that keeps its promises, that protects its own, doesn't use any real names. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Warm, real, the expression of a man who had just been surprised by something and was allowing himself to feel it. "Does it have a title?" he asked. She considered. The fire in the grate, the blizzard gentling itself beyond the windows, the lodge around them, warm and lived in, full of people sleeping and healing and existing in the way his world had always existed, quietly, fiercely, without requiring permission. "Claimed by the storm," she said. He looked at her for one more moment, and then, finally, completely, without qualification, he smiled, full and real and entirely human. The laugh that came with it was low and genuine, and it undid something in her chest that she was perfectly content to leave undone. He pulled her into him, not dramatically, just closed the distance and wrapped an arm around her and held. The way you held things you had no intention of setting down. She let herself be held. She put her head against his shoulder and felt the warmth of him and the steadiness of him and the world outside going white and quiet and new. They moved to the porch when the morning fully broke. The blizzard had gone in the night the way blizzards sometimes went, completely, as if it had never happened, and left behind a silence so absolute it had texture. 2 feet of snow covered everything in the absolute democracy of winter. The mountain beyond the tree line was blue in the new light. The forest was still. The sky was the particular pale gold of a sunrise that had earned itself. She stood with her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying that the morning wasn't already saying better. The forest beyond them was no longer a mystery to solve, no longer a story to crack open and explain. It was a world, whole and complex and alive, and full of people who had chosen it. And they were standing at its edge together. She thought about Sadie, about the scale she'd been trying to balance for years. She thought about the story she was going to write, careful and true, and shot through with all the things she'd learned about the difference between information and understanding. She thought about the amber emergency light, and the note under the door, and the hand on her shoulder on the ridge, and the forehead pressed against hers in the kitchen. She thought, "I walked into this valley looking for something I could expose. I found something I want to protect." That was the story. That was always the story. The mountain held its position. The forest breathed, somewhere in the trees, distant, unhurried, belonging completely to the world it inhabited. Something moved through the deep snow without sound. Not a threat, not a mystery, just life. Going on. The end, and that, beloved, is where we leave them. Lena and Zane, standing at the edge of a world she almost missed, and a love she almost talked herself out of. On a porch, in the quiet, the mountain behind them, and the rest of their lives ahead. If this story found you at the right moment, if you felt every hallway, every almost smile, every note slipped under a door in the dark, then you already know what to do. Leave me a comment below. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me which scene broke you open a little. Tell me if you were Team Lena from the first chapter, or if Zane had to earn you slowly. I read every single one. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is built for people who believe that love stories deserve to be told like they matter, like they're worth the time, like they're worth feeling. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And if someone in your life needs a story like this, share it with them. You might be giving them exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. Until next time, stay warm, stay open, and never stop believing in the forest.